Good morning, everyone, and welcome to DEI, Making the Arts Accessible to All. This is our first session in both the Arts and Culture track, as well as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track for Iowa Ideas 2022. I'm so glad you joined us, and I think in a few minutes you will be too. In this session, we're going to be talking about how to make the arts accessible to all, how our arts advocates are connecting underrepresented folks to pathways within the arts, and how we're recruiting artists of diverse backgrounds and perspectives. My name is Elijah Decius. I'm a features reporter here at the Gazette, and I'll be your host today. This session and all of our sessions within the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track for this year's Iowa Ideas are sponsored by Inclusive ICR. Before we get into our discussion, let's hear a quick word from our sponsor.
Hi friends, Angelica Vanetta, co-chair of Inclusive ICR. We are a coalition of over 220 employers in Eastern Iowa, all working together to grow the diversity and inclusion of our workforce, to create a space where employees feel a sense of belonging, included, and valued. Inclusive ICR is a proud sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track of the Iowa Ideas Conference. As you participate today, be sure to connect with other Inclusive ICR champions, as we'd love to share information with you about our upcoming coalition meetings, projects, and how our work is impacting positive social change in our region. Be sure to check out our website at inclusivicr.org for upcoming events and our e-newsletter. Thank you and have a great conference.
We have a great panel today. First up on our panel is Mia Boo. Mia, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. My name is Mia Boo. I'm the museum educator at the Des Moines Art Center. In my role, I create programming and manage events that help connect the community to the exhibitions and collection at the Des Moines Art Center.
Awesome, thank you. Next up, we have Kaven Hallman. Kaven, tell us what you do in the art scene.
Hi, I am the founder and producing artistic director for Mirrorbox Theater. We're in our 5th season producing contemporary plays in Cedar Rapids.
Great. Next up, we have LD Kidd. LD, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is LeVar Davis Kidd. I go by LD. I am the founder and CEO of 100% Over Racism, an apparel company that engages people with hard conversations. I am also a freelance choreographer in my 2nd year of graduate school at the University of Iowa on the choreography track in the dance department. And I've been choreographing in and around the corridor since 1997.
We also have Lindsay Keys. Lindsay, tell us about the hats you wear in the arts world.
Good morning, everyone. Lindsay Keist, Program Manager for Arts and Creativity from the Iowa Arts Council, which is a division of the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs State Department. I'm also the state's accessibility coordinator and serve on our Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion internal core committee.
Great. And last but certainly not least, we have Adam Knight. Adam, tell us about your organization and your work.
Hi, I'm Adam Knight. I'm producing artistic director at Riverside Theater in Iowa City. We're a professional resident company in our 42nd season. As producing artistic director, I'm in charge of programming and also executing our mission and vision for the organization.
Sure. Well, I'm going to just jump right in there. And this first question is open to anyone who feels led. Right now, what does access to the arts look like for underrepresented people at your organization or in your city?
Okay, so I'll jump in. Some of the ways that access looks like at the Des Moines Art Center, one of the biggest things is that we offer free admission to the museum. That's something that's been really powerful to me as a person growing up in Des Moines and receiving access to a space that other communities might not have. And so that's a big part of it. And then just being mindful about how much we can share that resource. So we offer classes and we have pretty extensive scholarships for our programs. Almost all of our programming is offered free. So really prioritizing like what resources we have and how we can share those. So we also have an access program that's been going on for quite a few years. It started as an artist in residence program that was part of the job when you were the artist in residence at the Art Center was to go and teach classes in the community. But then the demand for that became bigger and bigger, to the point that that became like a full-time job. So it created its own programming, and so now we have an entire group programs that reach out to about 30 different partners in the community, working with different populations of folks taking arts from the Art Center to areas in the community. So those are some ways that's how it looks at the Art Center.
Awesome. Kevin, I think you opened your mouth too. So let's let's hear from you.
Yeah, and I'll speak specifically to what I'm seeing in the theater community in the Cedar Rapids area, and I think that right now, in terms of access, I think that there are two intentional activities that are ongoing and that need to keep going, and that's both awareness and trust building. I think that what I've heard specifically from a member of our Mirror Box board, is this idea that for her as a young Black woman, she did not know that she would be welcomed into the theater community, and so I think there are people who are intentionally looking to make space for underrepresented and marginalized people from marginalized communities, and so I think that the awareness part comes first, and then the trust building in terms of making sure that people from underrepresented and marginalized communities understand that these efforts are not a single show. It's not we're gonna do fences and here's the opportunity for Black people to be on stage. It's building that trust so that people understand that this is again intentional. It'll be consistent and that it's genuine.
For sure. Adam, how about you? I'm curious to hear what Riverside Theater has been doing in this area.
Well, since I've arrived, I feel like I encountered a landscape that was very similar to the bad landscape that Kevin described, and that's not atypical. We had, I think, 2 actors of color in the season before I arrived, and that was something we instantly wanted to change. And I think it goes towards what Kevin was talking about with building awareness and trust building. I want to make sure that actors of color are in as many plays as possible, but also we should be trying to do fences. I think there's a place for both these masterpieces written by writers such as August Wilson, but also we need as many voices and perspectives as possible taking part in Shakespeare, taking part in a classic play, taking part in an Arthur Miller play. And so building those relationships and making sure that when people come to the theater, they see people that look like them is very important. One of our big initiatives since 2018 has been Free Shakespeare in Lower City Park. That used to be paid, ticketed, and now there's no financial barriers to entry. And one of the essence of that program is that our audience diversity numbers have really shot up. And what we're trying to do is learn lessons from that kind of programming and see how we can take that to our downtown main stage space. Because we're seeing the audiences that we want out there in the park. And I'm proud that we're also increasing diversity in the park so that when those audiences come, they see more actors that look like them.
For sure. Lindsay, I know you're in a little bit of a different background just because you cover a lot more of the state and you're not necessarily focused on one city. So tell us about the work you're doing.
Well, as you said, we are very interested in representing the diverse populations and geographies across the entire state. So thinking about how people are participating and leading our professional development, how many people are receiving grants from us, participating as panelists, for those grants on our board of directors, things like that. So we've started collecting demographics to understand who we're reaching, but also even more importantly, who we're not reaching, and really diving deep into why that is and what the barriers are to participation in our programs. As most of us have spoken to, building relationships with communities, but also I think an important aspect of that is transparency with those communities as far as what we are doing to advance these efforts, and inviting them and compensating them for participating in that work should they choose to do so. Listening to what people need in those communities, and then actively implementing and responding to those needs. And then most also important would be just kind of operationalizing our efforts, because I think one of those challenges is capacity. As a 5-person staff, we deal with that all the time while serving the entire state. So really putting those into like our line of work so that they're automatically like working towards DEI efforts and not an add-on to our work.
Yeah. And LD, I'm sure you're similar to Lindsay in the sense that you're not really tied to one city. So tell us about what you've been doing in this area and how you kind of have been helping everyone.
Yeah, and that's it's a really tough question as a freelance artist, because I'm going into spaces where I'm not necessarily introducing this type of work. I'm helping to facilitate the work that's already being done. And my line of work is also very often like a one and done type thing, where I go in for a workshop or I go in and teach a little bit of choreography and then I'm out of that space. But I think that the organizations that are actively hiring more people of color for the freelance side of things are doing that very purposefully, and they're allowing for not only a person of color to potentially have a job that maybe they haven't had in the past, but they're also allowing for those volunteers within each of those organizations to see somebody like them in a leadership role. And that's really important because, as we know, representation matters.
For sure. Before we go too much further, I want to get a sense of history and where we're coming from on this issue. Of course, there have always been folks in arts organizations who have been mindful of the need for equity and inclusion. I want to know, when did those efforts start to become more prominent or more formalized in your organizations? And how have you seen them evolve over the last few years? Adam, when did you start at Riverside Theater? Remind me.
I came in fall of 2018.
Okay. It sounds like you've seen a significant amount of progress since then.
I like to think so. I don't think that we're there yet. But you know, I came from New York City. I was there for 17 years. And one of the things I witnessed so often in the theater community, and it was like a broken record, where one of these major companies would announce their season and it was all white men. Or maybe as Kevin was describing, there was that one play that didn't fit that mold. And there was always an outcry, and then very little was done about it. And that's certainly, I think, the landscape that so many people would have found in the mid 2010s. And one of the things that we purposely tried to start doing is making sure that representation on our stage, play selection, at the very least, was hitting the demographic numbers of Johnson County. That seems like a very low bar to hit, but we weren't hitting it season after season before then. And so now, since I've arrived, we've been having at least 25% actors of color. The last year we had more than a third. We're having at least 25% plays by writers of color. This is not, we're not saving the world here, but we're trying to do the right thing and pushing the conversation forward. As a member of the National New Play Network, which is a national consortium of theaters devoted to producing new work, Riverside was part of a huge DEI initiative in 2019 that really changed the landscape of the new play world. National New Play Network mandated that any new members had to be theaters of color. And part of the reason for that was building a larger ecosystem where plays by writers of color would be fostered and celebrated. And that there was also board initiatives where the board saw an almost complete turnover and saw a 50% representation by BIPOC members. Part of that meant that some of us lost our board seats. So we lost a board seat for NMPN, but that's also part of the work, is giving up some of that privilege so that more voices can come into the fold.
For sure. And when you came back to Iowa, how did it compare to where you were in New York at that time and what was going on in New York?
Well, I mean, New York is an incredibly diverse place. But that said, the theater world was not nearly as diverse as it needed to be. I think that theaters need to represent the communities that they're in. They also need to be pushing the conversation forward. I think that in New York, it was the opposite problem, where the theater was representing a very small subset of the subscribers and patrons of those theaters, but not the community at large. A number of theaters are changing that in a huge way. Public theaters doing great work. I don't think any theater worth its salt would be presenting a season like some of these theaters were presenting 10 or 20 years ago. That might be because of public pressure, but I also see that as a good thing.
For sure. Steven, I'm curious if that tracks similarly to what you've seen in the last few years.
Oh, could you please repeat that, Elijah? I didn't quite.
I'm curious what kind of evolution you've seen at Mirrorbox in the last few years, and how closely that tracks to what Adam was telling us.
Yeah, so, like I said, we're in our 5th season, and over the course of those 5 seasons, we've done nearly 70 productions and readings, and really our approach has been consistent from the beginning. Over 40% of the performers on stage or on Zoom with us have been from the BIPOC community, and that same number in terms of the playwrights. I'll say, I think what has changed for us in particular is that as the national focus has expanded over this time, there are tools that make finding, particularly finding plays by writers from the BIPOC community, and also plays from women and transgender artists, increasingly easy to discover. I think the New Play Exchange was a tool that had already opened up, prior to our beginnings, but also has again gotten increased visibility, and it gives artistic directors and producers an opportunity to search for plays by demographics. And I think it's a really useful thing to look at your programming and say, whose voices are we not amplifying? And tools like that, tools like there's an organization called the Kilroys that puts out an annual list of unproduced and underproduced plays by women and transgender artists. And again, it's I think as far as our approach organizationally, not much has changed, but the access to those tools and the ability to share those tools with other people who are interested in pursuing similar work, I think has grown exponentially.
Sure. A few of you have talked about just the trust building that it takes to get to where we are now and to move forward. And I'm curious, what is the starting point for that trust? That has to be the hardest part, just starting with that trust building. I'm curious if anyone can say, how you start to build that trust in the first place. What's the starting point there?
I can speak just from. Oh, go ahead.
Nope, you were first.
I was just going to say, I can speak from an outside perspective that what I have seen is consistency when an organization, or in this particular case, a theater, is being consistent about their programming. That is the first step, in my opinion, of that organization starting to build trust. When people of color see, directors of color, when they see playwrights of color, when they see other performers of color consistently being a part of that and being welcome into that fold, I think that's a huge step in the starting of building trust.
Yeah, go ahead, Mia.
Yeah, LD, I love that. One thing that I'm thinking, just like in a micro version of that too is just for me it's listening. Like when I meet a new partner or when I'm working with someone who I'm excited about bringing into the art center, bringing their voice or vision, like really making that concerted time to give them like meaning the meetings that I make with them, and like being present and listening, and not having my own expectations of things, and really like coming to it with generosity and openness. And I love like facilitating, like helping people produce their dreams or their visions. And so I love showing up as a leader saying like, how can I help? How do you see this working? And then like, you know, making the challenges visible, but not letting anything like get in the way of people doing what they want. And so I think there has to be the sincerity of like, I have time for you and I will make time for you and I will listen. And this will be about your goal. I think that to me has made the relationships that I've built through my position at the Art Center sincere and strong, and only makes what the institution is doing so much better.
For sure.
I feel like we have oh, thanks, Kevin. I feel like we have a unique perspective too, being a government agency, and that does not necessarily instill trust with people for a good reason. So I would say, similar to what Mia's saying, just building relationships, but adding on to that, like starting from the beginning, knowing it's going to be slow and have no agenda. Just reach out to people and learn what they need to support them. Maybe you can collaborate further down the line, but I would take at least a year to start building relationships, building friendships with people, and just being human and putting a face to the organization, especially if you're a government agency.
Absolutely. Something I've always said to our reporters here is that you have to be there for the good times and the bad, or else people aren't going to trust you. So, Stephen, I think you wanted to say something?
Yeah, definitely along the lines of what Mia and Lindsay are sharing. And I think one of the important things to remember is as you're building these relationships, that you're building relationships with an individual, and no individual can speak for an entire demographic group. I think that's a really I think important piece to it. And yeah, just like I could not speak for all middle-aged, cis het white men. There are too many of us, too many perspectives. But I think that's an important part of that trust piece too, is treating people as individuals and not as as a representative of an entire group.
For sure. When did you all start to see audiences and artists start to demand more action and accountability from leadership to be inclusive and equitable for everyone, rather than just saying things that looked good on paper?
After George Floyd's murder, I think just across the country we saw demands for action, and I don't think the arts community was any different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that work was being done before, but it was this national incident that really had more people focused on, okay, if this can happen so easily, there need to be things being said, there need to be changes taking place, there just needs to be the removal of the systemic racism that exists. And that just, I think more people with a click were able to see this senseless act play out. And so that just made everybody engage in the conversation that much more than had previously been engaged.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Adam.
Specifically in the theater world, that in the summer of 2020, a list of demands went up by over 100 BIPOC artists called "We See You, White American Theater," and it really put the larger theater world here in America on notice that that the types of systemic racism within our institutions, in some ways hardwired into our institutions, was no longer acceptable. In addition to things like increasing representation, really looking at how our boards and our place selection processes work, there was also a lot of work rule changes. Things like getting rid of the 10 out of 12, which in our industry is a really hard, long day. But there's a lot of evidence that particularly harms artists of color. And really looking at those work rules, making sure that that what we're doing is not at the expense of Black bodies.
Mm. What are sorry, go ahead, Mia.
This is a conversation in a lot of ways that has been going on in museum communities for a while, just because the nature of what museums institutionally began as collections of wealthy people's stuff that needed protected. And someone pointed that out to me just a few years ago, and I was like, you're right, that's how it starts. But then, I think this conversation's been going on that I'm aware of, at least it's 2017, as museums as sites of social engagement and social change. How do we empower and our communities with these objects? How do we share ownership and agency, and really think of museums as shifting from temples to forums, and seeing that this is a place where we can engage with our own collective humanities, our own collective histories, and really showcasing conversations that are hard to say otherwise. I think that's one thing that I love about working at a contemporary art museum is there's some conversations that feel dangerous to have just personally, but if you put an art object in the middle of you and another person, then at the end of the day, you can walk away and still be okay. You can really hate Monet, and we can get at it, but at the end of the day, there's this inhuman thing that is striking the conversation. So we can have art objects talking about things like racism, talking about police brutality, talking, in sensitive ways or in thoughtful or new progressive ways. And the museum becomes a site for connection and conversation. And so I know this is something the museum has tried to shift for a while. And I think, like everyone was saying, is that, after 2020, things became more necessary in terms of a survival reason. But I think that this is something that museums were positioned to want to be for a while.
And I have had the opportunity to partner with the African American Museum of Iowa. So I can't speak to any other museums because I haven't partnered with them in the same way. But I know that the exhibits that the African American Museum of Iowa here in Cedar Rapids, they just put the work out, and it all is about engaging in conversation. And so it does become this forum, especially on those days where they do $1 ticket. And more people have accessibility to these exhibits that during the week, maybe they aren't able to do that. But I know it's a once a month thing. And now that they're closed, I'm not 100% sure because they're doing things at the Cedar Rapids Public Library and other spaces. But I think that they do a really great job of engaging people in conversation and creating the forum that Mia is talking about.
Yeah. Mia, was it hard to make that shift happen from a temple to a forum, or was it 2020 that really gave a sense of urgency to that movement?
Yeah. So I, from what I've read about other institutions, larger museums, there are people who are the criticisms of museums have been louder and louder. The fact that there are some museums that have so much work in their collection that they could literally never show it all. And is that ethical? I know just oh, my cats are fighting. I'm sorry. I told them I can't mute my microphone. But so the Art Center, we're about to celebrate our 75th anniversary. Free admission has been something that we've had for a long time. We exist because of donations and funders and trusts And the founder of the Art Center said that it was supposed to be a free museum, that it's supposed to be open 6 out of 7 days a week. Like, he had this vision that is meant to be extremely accessible. And the fact that we call it an art center instead of a museum is intentional, because it's not just a place for observing art, but also creating. It was designed to be a community space. And so in so many ways, like, we've been doing this all along, but things, of course, have shifted into like who's being represented in our galleries, who are we partnering with, who works there. All of those things are being challenged. But I think that the essence of what the Des Moines Art Center was meant to be, wanted to be this all along, and is just finding new ways to be that. Yeah.
I'm really curious. I have a question, Mia, if I may. This idea of the conversation. Do you feel like, as an organization, that you're focused more on the conversation, like patron to patron, or the conversation between the patrons and the institution? I mean, I'm sure there's a little bit of both, but I think that's because we focus on, we want to create plays that create conversations, but yeah, it's just interesting to me.
Yeah, and I find myself in that position specifically because I create resources to engage with the arts, so like educational resources. And for me, it's both. And we're constantly, like, I feel like it's easier for me to model and show people how to engage with each other, because I think that's kind of how that starts. I see so many people go to museums, and I tour kids a lot still, and I tell them a lot of adults just look at art and then they don't talk to anyone. And they just like look at it, read the label, and like they don't know what to do then. And so it's really important for me to show people like how conversations can come from a work of art. And so I have a podcast called Inspired Conversations, where I invite diverse folks from different backgrounds, they're not all artists, they're not all art historians. I invited people who own like a haunted house to go through an exhibition with me. And we're just sharing what our conversation is, so that people, I'm modeling like how you can look at art with other people and talk about it. And so I'm always putting questions in the galleries, because I think questions are a great place to inspire that response. And then in terms of like the community speak with the institution, I want that very much. I regularly like put like a QR code, leave us feedback about what you thought about this, and no one uses it. So we're like I made a phone line. I was like, this is great, and we like made sure that it was available in Spanish as well. And I was like, this is good. And like literally, we've had it for 2 years, and like not a single phone call. So like that is still hard. But whenever I'm engaging with people, I ask them about their experience, and in a way, just talking with the staff is them engaging with the institution. Our security guards are encouraged in ways to have conversations with people. And so like, we are not an untouchable thing. We have staff that work there that people can speak to and share their thoughts and feelings and ideas with. I just don't know how to do that in a more formal way. We're working on a survey, and hopefully that will help. I read our Google reviews when I'm bored. But I want people to feel empowered to have this conversation with the institution. But it starts with people just knowing how to respond to art and feeling comfortable in their interpretation being as valid as the curators, because people think that.
Do you think that part of the reason why the engagement of the QR code and the conversations in general has to do with preconceived notions of what is acceptable within
Yes.
art spaces? Because I just keep finding that I even have rules that I'm breaking down, because I think, okay, when I'm focusing on contemporary movement, I see that because of my history in a concert dance setting. But when I think about hip hop or urban dance styles or street dance styles, for whatever reason, I'm not picturing them as vividly in a concert space. But that's not true, because there are artists out there in the world that are creating these amazing pieces of work that exist in all different spaces, site specific. And I think that what one has to do is kind of question, can I wear a t-shirt to the theater? Can I,
Yes.
because some people don't go to shows because they're like, I don't want to get dressed up. And, it's like figuring out a way to break down some of those rules that we have in place. And then that makes art more accessible to more people.
Yes. I mean, in you saying that, it makes me think about like, when I was struggling and poor and working like 6 gigs, going to our exhibition openings were great because it was a free date with drinks and snacks. Great. And so people need to learn that these spaces are for them. Thank you for sharing that, because seriously, like, that is a huge part of the work that all of us are doing, is that how can you, just as you are right now, belong in this space? Like, you don't have to change anything. You don't have to care about things that you don't already care about. You don't have to present in a different way. Like, you just take your body and you put it here. Like, my dream is, like, I want the art center, since it's free, like, to be a place where like kids go and hang out after school instead of the mall, and they don't even have to look at the art. Like, how do we create engagement for people with what they want and need right now? And it takes that trust that people feel comfortable telling you, and that you'll believe them when they say what they need. But it's a big work.
You guys have really touched on some important points with accessibility, and I'm curious to hear more about accessibility with Kevin and Adam, and then Lindsay, in your efforts. What have you learned about making the arts more accessible to folks, in addition to being equitable and diverse?
Well, I'll say something that I've been hearing in the panel today, and it's interesting, and certainly is something that I want to keep considering and learning more about. Is as people are discussing cost accessibility, and I'll say that Mirrorbox, we haven't. We haven't done like a free night, or we haven't done any night where we make it free for a particular group of people, or anything like that. And it's interesting, it's been considered, and I think the alternate consideration is this question of like, would that be a reflection of a bias as well? Because the truth is that Black people have money too. Like, people of all communities have jobs, and can purchase tickets to things. And I know we just instituted for the first time, for our upcoming production of Drive, we're doing a BIPOC community night, which is inspired by Jeremy O. Harris's Broadway Blackout Night that he did for Slave Play. And other theaters across the country are adopting this. We're intentionally making space exclusively for members of the global majority, as well as their partners, if their partners happen to be white. And one of the things, as I spoke to some of the people that are already our close collaborators and people who are part of our community, I said, should we make tickets available for free? Is that something that would make something like this more successful? And again, this is feedback from individuals, so I don't expect them to speak for an entire community. But the question that I got was, again, from a very trusted collaborator, was, are you making it free for white people? And I said, no. He said, well, then don't do it for Black people. And so it's just, and so it's, so I guess this is me saying there are just as many questions as there are answers, I think, at this point, when it comes to the varied approaches to accessibility.
Yeah, and I think you might have some telepathic gifts, because a question came in from our audience asking if you could tell us more about your BIPOC community nights. Anything else you want to add on that?
Yeah, I hope I kind of covered it. Yeah, I don't want to, at the risk of repeating myself.
Yeah,
it's November 12th. I think that's the only thing that I didn't add. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest challenges and obstacles your organizations have been working through with DEI work and accessibility? Tell us how you work through those challenges.
Well, I think I'm just so inspired by some of the comments here, and I'm learning a lot. And I hope that the attendees are too. I feel like there's a desire for so many of us to fix the problem quickly. All of a sudden, we need a more diverse board. So let's do that next year. I think that what I'm learning is that a lot of groundwork has to be done, and a lot of conversations, and a lot of listening, and a lot of slow work. Building a board is part of a much larger ecosystem of building audiences, building artists' trust, building just a larger community that the board then reflects. And so finding the right balance of pushing those leadership positions into more to look more diverse, which they need to, while also doing the much kind of harder unsung work of making sure that we're putting more money in BIPOC artists' hands, and making sure that that we're reaching out to those communities who can then see those artists, who can then start attending more regularly, who can see that this theater is a place for them. I feel like we've had a lot more success with Free Shakespeare. Our mantra for that is Shakespeare is for everyone. And Shakespeare lends itself so much better to diverse casting, to gender bending, to doing all those things that that are so exciting right now in theater. Struggling sometimes to find those answers in a more traditional ticketed format, with plays that are a little bit more less open to interpretation. And it's challenging, but it's the work that we all have to be doing to build stronger institutions that are more equitable.
Adam, there were two things that popped up as you were sharing, and I wonder, do you or have you had any conversations about any of the Q brothers Shakespeare where they remix? Because that question comes from, I was living in California. My roommate had been cast as Romeo in Romeo and Juliet, and he said to me, as a dancer, hey, would you be willing to audition for the role of Mercutio? And I'm like, I have never done any Shakespeare, but why not? And the director said to me after the first read, can you make it less like a rap? And that was like, no, because to me, I'm reading this as hip hop, and so can you give me more details? And so then when I found out about the Q brothers and what they're doing, I'm like, okay, this is way more accessible to a BIPOC community than a traditional Shakespeare play is. So I don't know if you could speak to that at all.
We did the Bomb Ditty of Errors by them in summer of 2018, and as soon as you say that, I'm thinking, gosh, we need to do more of their work. So I'm a fan.
Excellent.
LD, what you're speaking to is something that I unfortunately have heard from so many artists of color. Is that this idea that when people are brought in and sometimes as part of a diversity effort, is that not only are people asked to do the work of being an artist, but then there is that additional work of having to code switch and of being and having that demanded of them, and whether they're I just think that is an experience that I'm hearing, that I've heard shared far too many times, and I think that's something that, especially as producers, as a director, as a producer, I think, we have to be really careful about, are we asking people to contribute extra labor unnecessarily?
Right.
And that leads me to another question. What role does belonging play in forming sustainable pathways for our diverse artists?
I think it ties back to some of the earlier conversations with that consistency, because if organization is being consistent in their DEI and A, and then there's the B, and then there's all these letters that we can add, but belonging is kind of ingrained in all of the work with consistency. Because if I feel like I'm part of an organization, it means that I feel as though they're constantly allowing for my voice to be heard. When Adam was speaking a moment ago, I kept thinking of the analogy of giving someone a Band-Aid for a wound, and that's all you do, as opposed to let's tend to this wound each day. Let's check and see if it's getting any better. Let's be consistent in that work of healing that has to happen, or that wound can become infected, because I don't know how to necessarily bandage a wound that I didn't create myself.
How about the rest of you guys? What role does belonging play in pathways, and how do we foster that sense of belonging?
So to me, I think that it's, I had someone explain to me that accessibility is important, but like invitations are more important. That intentionally wanting people there, not just like we're allowing you to be there, but we want you there, and we value that you there, and we see you and we hear you, and we know that you experiencing and you participating and you contributing like makes this better. And I'm grateful, and we show gratitude, and it's all about reciprocity and all these things that just like authentic relationships lend to. And so someone feeling like they belong feels like that they can be there as their whole selves. I'm thinking about a music venue that was like a home to me. And I remember I went there one night and I was like crying, because I was just like, I'd been through a lot, and I felt safe crying there. And that was a big deal for me to recognize, like, oh, I belong in this place. Like I can be here in all my ways. And so I think that, when people know that they can take their grievances to you or their concerns, and you listen, all of these things contribute to belonging. And like, at the end of the day, like that's something that we should want almost more than anything when it comes to diversity.
Absolutely. What more needs to be done to build pathways to the arts for folks from these backgrounds, and how do we ensure that this work continues to be sustainable? How do we make sure that this is a marathon instead of a sprint?
I think that we need to continue to have these conversations and be consistent in the conversations, because it has felt, at least to me, things have been very quiet the last couple of months, because there hasn't been some public incident that like nationally people are looking at. And so when it's not happening, then the conversation appears to not be happening as publicly. I know that people are still having conversations as individuals and as organizations within, their network, but it needs to be, in my opinion, more consistent on the global scale, even when the bad stuff isn't right in front of people's faces. And the reason why I speak to that is because, my brand is 100% over racism, and right after George Floyd's murder, sales were really great. So we were able to donate back to organizations like the African American Museum, the Academy for Scholastic and Professional Success, or Personal Success. But numbers have been down, sales have been down. And unfortunately, that means that I'm donating a lot less to organizations that are owned by people of color. And so it's never been about the sale, but those sales indicate that the conversations aren't happening the same. Angelica in that opening video had our mug in the background. I don't know if anyone caught that, but the 100% over racism logo was right there in the background of that video, and it made me smile. But I'm like, more people even purchasing a coffee mug and drinking out of it are going to engage others in conversation. So it's having the conversation on a more consistent basis and in a more public forum.
Yeah. How do you think we can continue to start those conversations and foster those conversations without, constantly being prompted by traumatic events on the news.
Doing the right thing, knowing that it's the right thing and doing
It should be
and
enough,
brave
really.
enough
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
Well, and for me, something I really believe in is like meaning it when you say that it's a safe space. I think that a lot of this work will come with mistakes. And so when people are allowed to make mistakes and then held accountable, and we address those right away, and so like having a healthy culture around that kind of growth, because that's something that, like, I read an article yesterday about just like some of the things that have happened in museums when people make mistakes that are yucky, and that there isn't accountability. Instead, it's just really harsh punishments. And so I think when people can feel safe to explore these things and share their concerns in a healthy way where we all listen to each other, I think, but that's a definite cultural shift for a lot of professional organizations. And you have to mean it when you say, like, we're doing this work.
And being transparent in that, because I think that
Yes.
that's what is missed a lot. Like, an organization will make a mistake and they'll settle it or solve it like under the table. And it's like, no, if you just did that publicly, people would see that you're consistently doing that work and you're owning up to the things that you have done wrong. And when a community sees that, that engages them even more.
Exactly. Like, yeah, perfectionism is a form of white supremacy. And so when we acknowledge we made a mistake and we're transparent about it, and we're like, this is what we did, and we'll continue to learn. And then people can give you feedback if they think that there's other things you can do, and you listen.
And other organizations, sorry, Mia, other organizations can learn from that as well. Like, seeing those mistakes, very often when we hide all of those things under the table, it looks like, oh, wow, we just had an immediate solution and we knew how to solve this problem. But if you see that pathway is very messy, that you made mistakes, that you took risks and you failed, I think is a really good example for other organizations.
I also think a really important piece in terms of staying consistent, even when there are not these traumatic incidents in the news, is normalizing sharing stories and producing work that is about featuring underrepresented communities, and doing work that is not exclusively focused on trauma, and doing work that I think by consciously removing that connection in your programming, so it's like, yep, there was this traumatic incident in the news. We're now going to do a play that is about racial trauma. It's like also making room for the plays that are about Black joy, that are about creativity, that are about family, that are about all of the myriad things that traditionally white plays have been about. Letting people be full humans, showing the full scope of humanity. That way, it doesn't feel necessarily tied to the news cycle.
Absolutely. Well, that is our time for today, and it certainly has flown by. My goodness. I want to thank all of our attendees for being a part of our session today, and I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists for lending their ideas, their expertise, and telling us about their lived experience. Next up on our arts and culture schedule today, I can't talk, is long-term sustainability for funding streams, hosted by Diana Nolan, which starts at 10:20. And if we gave you an appetite for more conversation, I'd encourage you to visit our discussion board section on Whova under the community tab, where we can keep the dialogue going. And I think I'm going to start a little thread there on resources folks can look to after the session to continue to educate themselves and help make changes in those areas. So I'd encourage our panelists to chime in there. So,
hey, Elijah.
Yeah.
I'm also going to throw in that discussion board just a discount code for 100% Over Racism. So if anybody wants to support that, I will be very specifically giving money back to the African American Museum as they are working on all of their building upgrades in their capital campaign. So
awesome. Thank you all so much. Have a great Iowa Ideas.
Thank you.